Well, I'm Anne Phoenix, and I work at the Thomas Coram Research Unit, which is part of the Institute of Education at the University of London. And I also, and of relevance for this, co-direct the Childhood Wellbeing Research Centre.
You obviously were focused on well-being throughout your whole of your presentation, but could you just summarise what you actually mean by well-being?
Yes. Well, well-being is really what helps people to thrive in their worlds. And it's something that is important in the present and for their future lives. So particularly when thinking about children, the phrase well-becoming might be important because you want to make sure that things that they're doing now will have a good impact on their futures. It's important too to divide it into objective and subjective. So all the features that we know help children to thrive, like having sufficient money, for their families to provide for them, as well as having good relationships with their families and so on, are important. But we need to see what they think and understand are the key features of well-being as well. So the subjective, as well as things that we know, make a difference.
There are obviously many factors that are going to contribute to children's and young people's well-being. One of the things you did say was that school was not just about education. So from that perspective, what do you see as the role of the school in developing young people and children's well-being?
Well, schools play a multifaceted part. Obviously, schools are important in terms of the attainment that children make, and we talk a great deal about that. And that's important to their well-being and to their well-becoming. But schools are about so much more. And I think a helpful way to think about it is that schools are about communities of practice. So in the Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger type sense, that they're about relations. And that what children and young people are doing at schools is meeting, relating. And it's very complex how they negotiate with each other what it is that their social relations are about. And that means that their well-being is tied up intimately at school with those negotiations, with those social relations.
I think increasingly young people are facing not just the school relationships and other things and the groups they have to deal with there, but they're also working more online. And Facebook and Twitter and other social tools are things we have for social networking. So do you think this is bringing an equity to groups and young people, or do you see it making the situation much more complex and more complex than perhaps it's ever been?
I don't know that it's making it more complex than it's ever been, but it's certainly complex, and it's an additional thing. So in that way, I guess you'd say it was more complex, because when there wasn't Facebook, it was just face-to-face interactions and telephonic interactions and so on. So it's an additional thing, which is complex, just as face-to-face interactions are. And I think what's really interesting about Facebook is that it doesn't make young people equal, in that, for a start, the number of friends that you have and who they are and who's accepted you as a friend are key, so that young people cannot afford not to have a good number of friends on Facebook. Better not to be there than to have very few friends, or what they would call sad friends, in quote marks. So that matters, but I think equally important is the fact that Facebook will have a huge impact on young people's well-becoming. Already there are cases of young people who have not been offered jobs because of how they've looked on Facebook, particular photographs of them and so on. And those traces of what they're like on Facebook, what they've been doing, don't disappear, even if they want them to do so. Now, somebody said only last week that what will have to happen to young people is that they'll have to change their names as they get older. I think that you can really imagine a future vision where we change our names after the teenage years and then again after our 20s in order to escape from the images and all the things about us that are on the internet. I think it's a fascinating and horrible idea.
It's a mix of both, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. Well, you can see it's attractive in some ways. If you could really leave behind your identities, that's the sort of draw that some people would find attractive, to really start again, but to have to do it because of the way in which you've been represented on the media is really problematic. So no, I don't think it makes for greater equality necessarily, even though it does give a lot of pleasure and does bring some equal features into play, in that everybody, as long as they can get online, wherever, can actually have access to this technology.
One thing that people have access to is consumption, as you say, in different kinds of brands. You said that brands were more important to boys than girls. I mean, just what impact does branding have on not just young people's identity, but in consequence their well-being as a result?
Well, one of the things about brands is they're so easily readable, so that young people can glance at what other young people are wearing and know a great deal about them, about their style group, about whether they're cool or not, and so on, as well as things to do with affluence and poverty. And so they're important, actually, in negotiating hierarchies, and as well as belonging and inclusion and exclusion. They're really important. Now, the reason that they're more important to boys is because boys are not into shopping for clothes regularly, and therefore they don't go... The girls and young women in our study tended to say more that they went to shops that themselves had a name and where they could pick up particular clothes that they liked and cheaply enough that they could buy them again, whereas boys wanted to symbolise that they had the right thing through their brands. They were also buying different things, so not clothes so much, but they were buying electrical equipment, games, for some, skateboards, things like that, and all of these had to be branded. Or many of the young men and boys thought that brands were important to this. So, not all, I think it's important to say that, so it's not an absolute, but many, and there's a big gender difference.
There's many facets to this. I mean, there's the branding, social networking we've discussed, but as people attended your session and they may see this interview on the web, what one key idea, what one message would you want them to leave this interview or this lecture with?
Well, as people become more interested in issues of well-being, I'd like them to recognise that well-being is both objective, so things that are distant from young people's understanding of it, but also subjective, and that the subjective is really important, and that what happens in schools is crucial to well-being, both currently, children's emotional engagement, their happiness, how readily they feel able to come to school and to take part in it in the first place. Because if you're really unhappy there, if you're really excluded, it's not easy to turn up every day. But also to their well-becoming. So what they've negotiated, what they've learned about social relationships and how those work for them, their position as subjects, as people with identities and so on, matter, and they learn that through school. But also, of course, schools give them the possibility to attain, and that affects their well-being and their well-becoming and their vision of themselves. And it's complicated because children are positioned very differently. They're positioned differently by racialisation, gender, social class, sexuality, and so on. And all of those have an impact on, and the intersection of those have an impact on how they can be. So that's what I'd like people to take away. Complexity, but that it matters, and that we want both parts, objective well-being and subjective well-being, to be represented in thinking about schools.